Hi, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Ricardo Vasconcelos, and I want to thank Patrícia and UCLA for inviting me for this book launch, book presentation at UCLA. I have to apologize for not being present, particularly to Patrícia, of course, but to everyone there. But I really couldn't make it today, as she knows. But at the same time, I want to thank you for accommodating this video presentation, which gives me a fair chance of sharing my view of Patrícia's excellent book. It's a privilege, I think, to be able to speak about it and to give my opinion on a book of a colleague. And one on top of it all, that is a very good book as well. So with no further delay, let's get into it. So published in 2019 by Ricardo em Belo Horizonte, Patrícia Lino's Manoel de Barros e a Poesia Cínica, o Círculo dos Três Movimentos com Vista ao Homem-Árvore, is a fundamental contribution to understanding better this poet, using an approach that is innovative both in the main points it makes about Manoel de Barros' writing and in its rhetorical and argumentative strategies. Before I get into Lino's study itself, I want to highlight some of the main points made by the authors of the Diálogo Preliminar, preliminary dialogue by Joana Matos Frias and Pedro Eiras, which serves as a preface to the book, and also by Arnaldo Saraiva on the end of the book in his short postface, note that bookends the volume. Matos Frias and Eiras regard the book as a study that presents to the reader a sort of initiation process, one that is arguably taken up by Patrícia Lino herself, as per their account. Certainly influenced by their closeness to the author, they identify in the study an autobiographic component. Of course, highlighting also the relevance of Lino's background in classical studies, which undeniably is crucial to the study. In another formulation, they describe Manoel de Barros e a Poesia Cínica as a book that presents the very process of Lino's maturing as a critic and a poet herself. The word they use is amadurecimento. In their perspective, the essay takes the readers in, places them in a reality that, stemming from Manoel de Barros' verses, gives new value to concepts and terms such as raiz, árvore, natureza, the roots, tree, the nature, for example, and a vocabulary that becomes structural to Lino's own analysis. Indeed, the preface notes that soon enough the reader feels as though we belong, and I'm quoting, we belong to that sort of tree, end quote, that is described in the last section of the study. And I would say a tree that grows from the inside of the book to its edges. And we'll get to that later. Arguably, this mentioned tree is a tree of life, latent or rather exuberant in Barros' poetry itself, but it is also a tree of literary branches, connections in that sense, in the sense that the book establishes links, though not necessarily influences, with many writers from Brazil, from Guimarães Rosa to Clarice Lispector, to Drummond de Andrade, Manuel Bandeira, and even as it affirms the uniqueness of Manoel de Barros' poetry, which is also something that the preface authors mention as well. I do not want to extend myself much further in echoing the paratexts of this volume, but it is worth noting another point made by Matos Frias and Eiras, with which I very much agree, and I don't want to present just as my own. As they have it, the studies, and I'm quoting, rescues one of the commonplaces of the critique of Manoel de Barros' work, a permanent microscopic analysis of neologisms, inventions, verbal creativity, etc. End quote. This happens, I would say, because Lino chooses to link this sort of classical approach towards Barros' work to a broader discussion over the overarching themes of this poetry, namely a reflection on death and an initiation to language, rather than getting stuck exclusively on the actual linguistic phenomena that the poetry is so well known for. Arnaldo Saraiva's short Push-Fácil likewise points out that Patrícia Lino manages to dodge the commonplaces of Manoel de Barros' criticism, namely, and I'm going to quote also Saraiva, namely the simple exploitation of linguistic aspects, lexicon, syntax, of stylistic aspects such as metaphors, synesthesias, or the characteristics of oral or colloquial discourses in Barros, as well as a study of the main literary influences, be they modernist, surrealist, esoteric ones, or even a more or less scholastic description of themes and motives connected to the childhood world or to the reality of the region of Mato Grosso, end quote. Whereas Saraiva's description of such critical commonplaces that Patrícia Lino is avoiding makes it sound as though not much would be left. And also Saraiva indeed is right. In fact, it's Patrícia Lino's approach that makes her study completely unique, rather than the specific topics that are mentioned, which she does in a way also continue addressing. So to address the book, let's first commit to avoiding a specific topos that may cause some noise in the reception of Lino's writings at this point and likely for a little while. Let's commit to not addressing the author's age or youth, which ends up being pointed out in the previously referred paratexts. We should also reject the degree of familiarity that arises from addressing her routinely as a Patrícia, which keeps her under our wings when she was never there to begin with, her wings having spread open and taken off when we weren't even looking in that direction. What I would say is that there is another aspect that will inevitably become a commonplace of the reviews of Patrícia Lino's production, namely a linking between her work as a scholar critic and her work as a poet and visual artist. That connection, however, will only become more relevant, indeed fundamental, as the author continues writing. In pointing it out, will not likely encroach in any analytical approach to her studies. Manoel de Barros e a Poesia Cínica is a study of the relevance of specific themes that are at the center of Barros's work, namely death, the links between the origins of human communities, excuse me, and human language, and the ways in which the poetic word is interconnected with that original cry, the characteristics of the Poesia Cínica and the metamorphosis of the human being into nature, here called a second birth. Structurally, the book is organized in 4 parts, 3 movements, as they are called, addressing precisely the themes of death, origins, and the Poesia Cínica, and the last section entitled The Tree Man, Homem Árvore. From the beginning, it is clear that Lino's book relies tightly in a visual schema that interprets Barros's process and defines the structure of the very study. In fact, these are at the basis of the book layout, as even the index, which I can point out, will show a circular movement. This index shows a circular movement, an aspect that might seem like a small detail, but makes all the difference. And one feature that is interesting is, for example, the very tiny arrows that are not going to be visible, but there are little tiny arrows around pointing to a counterclockwise articulation of these 3 to 4 sections, since they define the direction of emotion. The first movement, addressing death and earth, brings human bodies, such as the poet, the reader, closer to the ground, makes them try that humbling experience of touching the earth. The second movement, digs deeper, carves through the soil in search for an original cry, and our possible origins, existential and discursive ones. The third movement is dedicated to the characterization of Poesia Cínica in the classical period, and as conceived in Manoel de Barros' language. A fourth motion, not called movement, though, is a conclusive section dedicated to what Lino calls the second birth, one that is materialized in fusions with nature, and that is also focused on the symbol of the tree, namely linked to Barros' poetic character of Bernardo da Mata. So let's delve more deeply into the movements, starting with the first movement. I'll quote from Manoel de Barros: "O chão tem gula de meu olho, a gula do chão vai comer meu olho. The ground is eager for my eye, the ground's greed will eat my eye." Barros' language, as Lino notes, resonates multiple traditions of linking the earth, the soil, the ground with death, including the biblical "for dust thou art" and "unto dust shalt thou return." In Manuel de Barros' work, O chão é ensino, the ground is an education. On the other hand, Patrícia Lino's rhetorical method juxtaposes concepts highlighting new meanings. She states, Manuel de Barros invites you to another kind of knowledge, which truly is at the base of the exercise of bending yourself down to the ground, period, to the poem. Ground and poem are synonyms in this context, through contiguity and metaphor, two of the preferred argumentative strategies of Patrícia Lino in her study. How can a poem, a poet, bend itself or herself towards the ground? The reader is required perhaps to do the same and to adhere to the language used by the essayist. In Masonic initiation rites, the candidate is asked to lower himself to the ground floor of King Solomon's temple, in the hopes that he will understand what is not directly explained, regarding the need to link individual conscience with the world. In the poem Encontro de Pedro com o Nojo, Pedro meets disgust, or Pedro meets mourning, if you consider that nojo also denotes the feeling in the face of death. According to Patrícia, Pedro, I quote, becomes one with darkness and, like the rose, does not understand it. The exercise is repeated, and at the second time around, the reading becomes corporeal. Dirt ate his abdomen. The dirt full of pores, fermented in roots, rotten roses, corrupted bugs, birds' feathers, leaves and rocks attracted him. So we can ask, how can this ultimate humbling experience of being laid onto the ground in a 90-degree motion as death is met be connected to the symbolic initiation process of feeling that ground? But of course, both of course are knowledge, and it is up to you to believe whether or not you will learn in any of these processes, humbling to the ground or dissipating yourself in it. Barros certainly seems to indicate that you might, even if you only learn with your own finitude, and if you only learn your finitude. And Lino adds that that space between life and death is the locus of the poem. Thinking of the second movement, quoting Barros as well, I'll read a passage. Dialecto coisal, larval, pedral, etc. Nasceria uma linguagem madruguenta, adâmica, edénica, inaugural, que os poetas aprenderiam. A dialect that is thing-like, rock-like, larvae-like, etc., would be born out of an early morning, Adamic, Edenic, inaugural language that poets would learn. Patrícia Lino considers the well-known linguistic imagination and lexical deconstruction and recreation processes of Manuel de Barros as instrumental precisely to relearning nature by unlearning nature. Unlearning it from a lexical standpoint, I would call it dis-automatization of meanings, is, as per Lino, not a process in and of itself, but rather the process of learning to view anew the natural world that surrounds you. In fact, I would add, there does not seem to be, for example, a regionalistic goal of collecting and presenting the Mato Grosso dialect in a more ethnographic manner, per se, but rather that goal of illustrating how this vocabulary necessarily implies specific worldviews, speaking with the Mato Grosso vocabulary has implications into the worldview that you have. And moreover, when the poet reinvents even that vocabulary from Mato Grosso, it is bound to re-equate it so as to render new perspectives of the surrounding world. Innocence is a topos in Manuel de Barros, it's a common theme. But is this innocence of the idiot that Lino refers, the figure of the feeble-minded, the early speaker, even the infans, a form of, or forms of naivete? Could it be considered naivete at all? Lino brings up Suzuki's point according to which retrieving innocence is only possible after you have lost that innocence. Naturally, no paradise would be regained without having been expelled from it. But in the original Eden, humans had not differentiated themselves from nature, as Patrícia points out. Evidently, we are not in that Eden anymore. We're not even in Kansas anymore. Quoting Agamben, Lino points out that language and childhood are always connected in a circular manner. In truth, we could add that one, acquiring language, necessarily defines the other, childhood. And Lino quotes Barros expressing a metapoetic desire regarding this. Precisely that desire to acquire, for poets to acquire that dialect that is thing-like, rock-like, larvae-like, and that would be born out of an early morning, Adamic, Edenic, inaugural language. We are far from Carlos Drummond de Andrade's beautiful proposal of being gauche in life, a presentified irreverence that maintains the memory of childhood. In Barros, the issue is not whether you keep up the reverence of your childhood, but whether the poet can re-educate his eye and his tongue to be more like that child when she or he first describes reality without having yet learned the crystallized code. Coming to the third movement, another quote from Manoel de Barros. Só as crianças e as putas do jardim entendiam sua fala, de furnas brenhentas. Only children and whores in the garden understood his speech of darkened hearths. The third movement leads to an understanding of Barros's works as Poesia Cínica, or Cínica specifically. Lino is inspired by Sloterdijk's distinction between cynismo and cynismo, cynism and cynicism. Excuse me. Paraphrasing the author, a simple distinction is that cynical behavior implies a melancholic interiorization of the actions that the reverence of the classical cynic author and philosopher would publicly take. Diogenes is the iconic quintessential cynic from the classical age, who chooses to display a behavior that is fracturing and deviating from publicly accepted norms. In that behavior, which could even include public defecation and urination, sexual intercourse, and or masturbation, the cynic rejects shame altogether, often with humor. As Patrícia Lino reminds us, the cynic's method is indeed laughter, not analysis. Manoel de Barros precisely puts forth a vision of poetry that seems to take up this method. In his Materia da Poesia, he calls for a number of principles that rule his poetry, or should rule poetry, such as, I quote, the abolition of the hierarchy of objects, the end of social ambition, the abolition of social hierarchy, resorting to humor, the causing of repulse, and the presentation of scatological realities, and the linkage between the very discourse of the cynic and the discourse of the child. Necessarily, the body is central in all of these processes, and in her book, Patrícia Lino conceptualizes specifically the role of body parts such as the head, the eyes, the mouth, the genitalia, and all the vocabulary that is associated with it, revisiting the use Manoel de Barros gives to such concepts and to such language. So finally, the fourth section, not described as a movement though, is titled as The Tree Man. In it, Patrícia addresses the notion of a second birth, tightly articulated with the concept of metamorphosis as expressed by Ovid, or Spinoza's idea of a life inside another life, motivated by desire. Focusing on the poetic character Bernardo da Mata, by Manoel de Barros, Lino addresses how he is presented in the process of linguistically transforming himself into a tree. It is worth quoting Patrícia Lino, who provides a reason for that specific type of metamorphosis. Quote, an archetype of the vital evolution, the cosmic tree, besides symbolizing the cyclical growth of nature, is also connected to individual maturity, in a sense of ascension, which implies renouncing weakness or imperfection, and ultimately of spiritual fulfillment. In sum, Bernardo is an example of the individual that goes full circle, and we can think again of the circle that is implied in the book. This is another of the illustrations of that very circle, right? And in sum, Bernardo is an example of the individual that goes full circle, the circle proposed by Patrícia Lino's approach and this book's structure. From coming to the ground to learn death and nature, to seeking more familiarity with an original language, to becoming the cynic poet, only to ultimately metamorphose into an expanding tree from the ground and up. Revisiting some of the main topoi of Manoel de Barros' tradition of criticism, Patrícia Lino puts forth a very personalized and highly creative account of his poetry in a narrative that is incredibly coherent, one in which poetry is seen as a process, and writing and reading the means to reinventing our relation with language, with nature, and of course with life. It is certainly an innovative and welcome contribution to our field that opts to create, that opts to, rather than over-explain, opts to create the potential for further interpretations to arise based on Manuel Barros' poetic discourse. So thank you and much success in the for this book as this brilliant career continues arising. Thank you.